Britain was once the richest, most powerful nation on earth. At its peak in the early 20th century, the British Empire controlled a quarter of the world's land and population. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. London was the financial capital of the world. British industry led the world in manufacturing, shipbuilding, textiles, and steel. Britain invented the Industrial Revolution. It built railways across continents. Its navy ruled the seas. And its wealth, accumulated over centuries of trade and empire, seemed limitless. But that Britain is gone. What remains is a shadow. A country that once shaped the world now struggles to heat its homes in winter. A country that invented modern capitalism now has the lowest productivity growth in the developed world. A country that once exported manufactured goods to every corner of the globe now imports nearly everything. Britain is not collapsing dramatically, like Argentina or Venezuela. It is not experiencing hyperinflation or currency collapse. It is dying slowly, quietly, through managed decline. And the British political class has accepted this. They no longer speak of making Britain great. They speak of managing the decline, of making cuts, of raising taxes, of rationing healthcare. Britain is going broke, not in a sudden crisis, but through decades of poor decisions, structural problems, and a political system that cannot make the hard choices necessary to reverse course. This is The Wealth Records, where every video will change how you see money, history, and the systems controlling your life. If you're new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because what you're about to learn is the story of how the world's greatest empire became an economic also-ran, and why there is no plan to fix it. If you're British or have watched Britain's decline, do you think it can recover, or is managed decline inevitable? Drop your take below. The National Health Service is the most sacred institution in British life, more sacred than the monarchy, more sacred than Parliament. Criticizing the NHS in Britain is political suicide. Politicians of all parties pledge their devotion to it. The public venerates it. During COVID, people stood on their doorsteps every Thursday evening and applauded healthcare workers. Protect the NHS became a national slogan. The NHS is Britain's religion. And like many religions, it is based on faith rather than evidence. Because the NHS, for all the devotion it inspires, is failing catastrophically. The NHS was founded in 1948 with a noble goal: healthcare free at the point of use, funded by taxation, available to everyone. No one would be bankrupted by medical bills. No one would be denied care because they could not pay. For a generation recovering from World War II, this was revolutionary. And for decades, the NHS worked reasonably well, but it does not work anymore. If you need emergency care in Britain today, you will wait an average of 8 hours in an accident, an emergency department, sometimes longer. In some hospitals, patients wait over 12 hours. 12 hours. In a wealthy, developed country, if you need surgery, you join a waiting list. As of 2026, over 7 million people are on NHS waiting lists. 7 million. In a country of 67 million. That is over 10% of the population waiting for treatment. Some wait months, some wait years. Hip replacements, knee replacements, cataract surgery, cancer treatment. If you're lucky, you wait 6 months. If you are unlucky, you wait 2 years. And while you wait, your condition worsens, your quality of life deteriorates, and in some cases, you die waiting. This is not hyperbole. Thousands of people die each year on NHS waiting lists. Excess deaths that would not have occurred if treatment had been timely. If you need to see a general practitioner, a family doctor, you will wait weeks for an appointment. In many areas, you cannot get an appointment at all. GP surgeries are overwhelmed, understaffed, operating at capacity. Some have stopped accepting new patients. If you do get an appointment, it will likely be over the phone. A 10-minute call, not an in-person examination. And if the GP determines you need to see a specialist, you join another waiting list. This is healthcare in Britain today, a system that is free at the point of use, but so overwhelmed that it barely functions. And the costs are not born in money. They are born in suffering and delayed treatment and lives lost. The NHS consumes over $180 billion per year. That is roughly $2,700 for every person in Britain. It is the largest single item in the government budget, larger than defense, larger than education, second only to pensions. And it is growing. Every year the NHS demands more money, and every year the government gives it more. Since 2000, NHS funding has more than doubled in real terms, doubled. And yet, the service has gotten worse. Waiting lists have grown, waiting times have increased, staff shortages have worsened. How is this possible? How can you double funding and get worse outcomes? The answer lies in the structure of the NHS. It is a centrally planned, government-run monopoly. There is no competition, no price signals, no mechanism to allocate resources efficiently. Hospitals cannot refuse patients even when they are full. They cannot charge for services even when demand exceeds capacity. And they cannot close even when they are losing money. The result is rationing by queue. If you need care, you wait, and if the wait is too long, you suffer, or you pay for private care, which more and more Britons are doing. Private health insurance in Britain is growing rapidly. Those who can afford it are opting out of the NHS. They pay for private consultations, private surgery, private hospitals. This creates a two-tier system. The wealthy get fast, high-quality care. Everyone else waits. And the political class, which pledges its devotion to the NHS, quietly uses private care. Boris Johnson, when he needed medical treatment, used private doctors. So did other MPs. They praise the NHS publicly, but they do not use it themselves. The NHS is also facing a demographic crisis. Britain's population is aging. The baby boomers, born after World War II, are now in their 70s and 80s. They are entering the phase of life where they need the most health care. Chronic conditions, multiple medications, hospitalizations, and there are millions of them. By 2030, 1 in 4 Britons will be over 65. By 2050, nearly 1 in 3. This means ever-growing demand for health care. And the NHS, which is already overwhelmed, has no plan for how to handle it. The solution would be to increase capacity, build more hospitals, train more doctors and nurses. But Britain is not doing this. Medical school places are limited. Training takes years. And even when doctors and nurses are trained, many leave. They emigrate to Australia, Canada, or the United States, where they are paid far more. A GP in Britain earns around $80,000 to $100,000 per year. In Australia, the same GP earns $120,000 to $150,000 and pays less tax and enjoys better weather. The choice is obvious. And so Britain trains doctors and nurses at great expense and then watches them leave. This is the brain drain, and it is accelerating. Nurses are leaving in even greater numbers, burned out, underpaid, overworked. During COVID, nurses were celebrated as heroes. After COVID, they were offered a 1% pay rise, below inflation. A real terms pay cut, many quit. Some left healthcare entirely, others moved abroad. And the NHS, already understaffed, became even more so. The government's response has been to import healthcare workers from abroad, from the Philippines, from India, from Nigeria. These workers are paid less than British workers. They accept worse conditions, and they fill the gaps. But this is not a sustainable solution. It is exploiting poorer countries by taking their trained healthcare workers, and it does not address the underlying problem, that the NHS is a system designed for a different era, a different population, and it cannot cope with the demands of the 21st century. Britain's economic stagnation began long before Brexit, but Brexit made it worse, much worse. When Britain voted to leave the European Union in 2016, the campaign promised economic benefits. Take back control. $350 million a week for the NHS. Free trade deals with the world. None of this materialized. Instead, Brexit created trade barriers with Britain's largest trading partner. The EU accounted for nearly half of British trade. Overnight, that trade became more expensive, more bureaucratic, more difficult. British businesses that exported to the EU now faced customs checks, tariffs, regulatory barriers. Small businesses, which could not afford the new costs, stopped exporting. Larger businesses moved operations to the EU. Manufacturing that had been based in Britain relocated to Germany, France, or Poland. The City of London, Britain's financial hub, lost business to Frankfurt, Paris, and Amsterdam. Banks moved operations, jobs moved, and Britain's economy, already sluggish, slowed further. GDP growth since Brexit has been the lowest in the G7. Lower than the United States, lower than Germany, lower than France, even lower than Italy. The only major economy with worse growth is Japan. And Japan has the excuse of a declining population. Britain's population is still growing, but its economy is not. Productivity, the measure of how much each worker produces per hour, has stagnated. British workers are among the least productive in the developed world. A British worker produces 20% less per hour than an American worker, 15% less than a French worker, 10% less than a German worker. This productivity gap has existed for decades, but it is not closing, it is widening. Why? Because Britain does not invest. Business investment as a percentage of GDP is the lowest in the G7. Companies do not invest in new equipment, new technology, new training. They squeeze what they can from existing resources, and the result is low productivity, low wages, and low growth. Brexit was supposed to free Britain from EU regulations. Red tape was blamed for holding back the economy. Leave the EU, the argument went, and Britain could deregulate, become more competitive, attract investment. But this did not happen. Britain left the EU and replaced EU regulations with British regulations, often identical, sometimes worse. And businesses, instead of experiencing less red tape, now face two sets of regulations, one for selling to the EU, one for the domestic market. This is the opposite of what was promised, and it has made Britain less competitive, not more. The other promise was trade deals. Britain would negotiate its own trade deals with the rest of the world, and it has. trade deals with Australia, with Japan, with Canada. But these deals are tiny compared to the trade lost with the EU. The Australia deal, for example, is expected to increase British GDP by 0.08%, 0.08%, over 15 years. This is a rounding error. Meanwhile, trade with the EU, which represented nearly half of all British trade, has fallen sharply. Exports to the EU are down over 15% since Brexit. Imports are down less because Britain still needs EU goods. The result is a larger trade deficit. Britain is importing more than it exports, and paying for it with borrowed money. Brexit did not cause all of Britain's problems, but it made them worse, and it squandered an opportunity. Singapore-on-Thames was the vision some Brexiteers had, but that required political courage, and Britain's political class lacks it. Instead, Britain got the worst of both worlds, out of the EU. But without the benefits of independence, Britain's cost of living crisis is severe. Energy bills have tripled, food prices have risen 25% or more. Rent, especially in London and the southeast, is unaffordable for most young people. The average rent in London is over $2,000 per month for a one-bedroom flat, in a city where the median salary is around $35,000 per year. That means half of gross income goes to rent, before tax. After tax, rent consumes nearly all take-home pay. This is unsustainable, and it is why millions of young Britons still live with their parents, or share flats with multiple roommates well into their 30s. Home ownership, once the norm for middle-class Britons, is now unattainable for most under 40. The average house price in Britain is over $290,000. In London, it is over $500,000. A young couple, even with two incomes, cannot afford a deposit. Banks require 10% to 20% down. That is $50,000 to $100,000 in cash, which takes years, sometimes decades, to save. And while they save, prices keep rising. So the goal moves further away. This is not just a London problem, it is national. Manchester, Birmingham, Bristol, Edinburgh, all have seen house prices soar beyond the reach of ordinary workers. The result is a generation locked out of home ownership, locked out of wealth accumulation, and locked into paying rent to landlords who bought decades ago when prices were affordable. Energy bills are another crisis. Britain is heavily dependent on natural gas for heating and electricity. When global gas prices spiked after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, British energy bills exploded. The average household energy bill went from $1,000 per year to over $3,000. Some households pay more. Pensioners on fixed incomes faced a choice: heat or eat. Some chose to keep their homes cold, to wear coats indoors, to ration their heating. In a wealthy country, this is disgraceful. But it is reality. The government introduced price caps and subsidies. But these were temporary, and they did not solve the underlying problem, that Britain has not invested in energy infrastructure. It closed coal plants, it shut down nuclear plants, and it became dependent on imported gas. Renewable energy was supposed to fill the gap, wind and solar, but these are intermittent. They produce power when the wind blows and the sun shines, not when demand is highest, and Britain has not built enough storage capacity to compensate. The result is an energy system that is expensive, unreliable, and vulnerable to global shocks. Britain's national debt is now over $2.7 trillion. That is 100% of GDP, the highest it has been since the 1960s, when Britain was still paying off World War II debts. And it is growing. Every year, the government runs a deficit. It spends more than it collects in taxes. And it borrows to make up the difference. This year, the deficit will be over $100 billion. Next year, similar, and the year after. There is no plan to balance the budget, no plan to reduce the debt, just endless borrowing. And the cost of servicing that debt is exploding. Interest payments on the debt now exceed $100 billion per year. That is more than the defense budget, more than the education budget. Money that could have been spent on infrastructure, research, or investment is instead spent on interest payments. And as interest rates have risen, those payments have grown. When rates were near zero, Britain could borrow cheaply. Now, with rates at 5%, the cost has quintupled, and Britain is trapped. It cannot cut spending. The NHS, pensions, and welfare consume the majority of the budget. Cutting these would cause political chaos. It cannot raise taxes much more. Britain already has the highest tax burden in 70 years. The Conservatives, traditionally the party of low taxes, have raised taxes repeatedly. Income tax, national insurance, corporate tax. Even inheritance tax thresholds have been frozen, pulling more people into higher brackets. Despite this, revenue is not keeping up with spending, because the economy is not growing. And without growth, tax revenue stagnates. This is the debt trap. No growth, rising debt, rising interest payments, and and no political will to make the cuts necessary to escape. Britain is slowly going broke, not in a sudden default, but in a grinding erosion of fiscal capacity. And when the next recession comes, or the next crisis, Britain will have no room to respond. It is already borrowing heavily in peacetime. In a crisis, the borrowing will explode, and markets, eventually, will lose confidence. Interest rates will rise further, and Britain will face a true fiscal crisis. 50,000 young Britons emigrate every year. Doctors, engineers, software developers, accountants, the educated, the skilled, the ambitious. They are leaving to Australia, to Canada, to the United States, to Dubai, anywhere that offers better pay, lower taxes, and a higher standard of living. Doctors are leaving because they can earn double in Australia, with better weather, less bureaucracy, and actual support staff, so they are not drowning in paperwork. Finance workers are leaving for New York or Singapore, where salaries are 50% to 100% higher, and taxes are lower. Tech workers are leaving for Silicon Valley or Austin, where the pay is triple and the opportunities endless. And young professionals, looking at the cost of living in Britain, the unaffordable housing, the stagnant wages, the high taxes, are asking themselves why they should stay. And many are concluding they should not. This is the brain drain, and it is devastating, because the people leaving are the ones Britain needs most. The high earners, the taxpayers, the innovators. They are the future, and they are leaving. What remains is an aging population. Pensioners who consume services but do not produce, and low-skilled workers, many of whom are immigrants, filling gaps in healthcare, hospitality, and manual labor. Britain is importing low-skilled labor and exporting high-skilled labor. This is economic suicide, and there is no plan to stop it, because stopping it would require making Britain attractive again, lower taxes, affordable housing, better public services, higher wages, and none of these are happening. So the drain continues, and Britain's future weakens every day. History doesn't repeat, but if you don't understand it, it will crush you all the same. Britain's decline is not inevitable. It is the result of choices, political choices, to avoid hard decisions, to promise benefits without paying for them, to regulate without considering the costs, to tax without delivering value, and to accept managed decline as preferable to painful reform. Britain could reverse course. It could deregulate aggressively, cut taxes, build infrastructure, fix the NHS by introducing competition and market mechanisms, attract investment. But this would require political courage, and Britain's political class has none, so the decline continues, quietly, slowly, until one day Britain will look around and realize it is no longer a wealthy country, just a former empire, living on past glories and borrowed money. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. The Wealth Records. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.